Hello, hello. Welcome to our third knowledge clip focusing on the theoretical framework section of your sustainability writing assignment. So let's go ahead and have a quick look at the main details or the main purpose of the theoretical framework in this writing assignment. So as I have mentioned, sort of the approaching the paper video, I would recommend that the theoretical framework takes up a large portion of your writing assignments. And this is really where you are describing, as the goal says, relevant information and literature that helps you answer your central or your research question. In this case, you really want to include those core characteristics and key concepts that are relevant to your chosen factor, and again, relate back to your central question. Since in this writing assignment in particular, something that is different from previous years is that there's no proper analysis section. I'm going to combine a little bit of the analysis component in the theoretical framework primarily, and also a bit in the conclusion section. So that will also be included here as a goal of the theoretical framework. And in general, the theoretical framework is really there to provide that background, to define those key concepts, and to explore further how you are going to essentially evaluate your research question on given factors and given criteria. So you should first develop this in the theoretical framework, and then, of course, link this to your central question. And then you can also segue into that, or based on that, into the conclusion section. So just to very quickly recap your assignment, again, you want to essentially choose one of the above mentioned factors, so fairness, effectiveness, acceptability, and also, of course, the measurement of effectiveness. And you want to essentially discuss how we can relate these factors to get a better understanding of its effect on climate change and, of course, kind of policy implementation for governments as well. So, of course, depending on your research question, you want to define the key concepts that are stated in your research question. You also need to define resource depletion and also define the relationship or describe the relationship between scarcity and depletion in terms of tragedy of the commons as well. So there's some key things that you should include in your theoretical framework that we'll also look into a little bit more in a second. And of course, again, other concepts, other criteria, and so on are going to be highly dependent on what you chose as your central question in your introduction that you have stated, or have stated in the introduction, and of course are bringing back here in the theoretical framework. So in terms of the actual structure and content of the theoretical framework, I recommend two main parts to help you sort of break down what to cover in the theoretical framework. And that is first the background, and then of course the relevant criteria and sort of a mini or brief analysis. So firstly, starting off with the background. The main goal of the background section in your theoretical framework is to focus really on the description, so the what, and the explanation, or the essentially how, or the why. So key things, again, to describe and define are resource depletion, scarcity and depletion, and explaining, of course, the tragedy of the commons and how there are different views regarding this issue. And of course, relevant concepts and the markets that you've decided to explore. So what factor have you chosen? And what is the gauge there for the research question that you are exploring? Some things that you could explore, and of course use your AI as an extra tool, along with, of course, the academic literature and articles. So some topics that you could explore are, for example, degrowth. You can also describe the factor you will use to evaluate policy implementation, and of course evaluate the literature that has been used in class. So explore some relevant topics per suggestion of AI, and also just your own findings in the literature to help you sort of develop those key definitions and key terms that are going to be relevant for evaluating your research question. And in terms of those key terms or key concepts to find using your literature, besides, of course, the definitions that are required for you to do or to explain in your theoretical framework, I would, of course, recommend to explore maybe around 2 or 3 of these topics just in a bit more depth. So try to go beyond the surface level for a select few rather than a broader range of concepts and topics, but not really going any deeper than the surface level. So, of course, these are, again, really relevant and dependent on your research question. So after you have defined your key concepts, then it is really the moment to actually, find or define key terms or concepts that are actually going to help you evaluate your research question. And that is essentially what the criteria section is about. So you really want to, in the criteria and analysis part, reflect on that particular chosen factor to consider for policy implementation regarding climate change, and of course, the fairness, effectiveness, acceptability, so that particular factor. So essentially your criteria are ways to measure and analyze your chosen factor and, again, how it relates to policy implementation and and climate change as well. So your criteria are kind of like grading categories for evaluating the extent to which your research question is valid or not. And some key things that I would recommend to develop your relevant criteria would be definitions of how effectiveness versus optimality can be defined, look at what fairness is and how it can affect acceptability of measures, and look, of course, through the academic literature for common themes and arguments, such as court cases, environmental impacts, involvement of corporations, timelines, etc. And of course, you can use your AI to help you identify and categorize these topics and find noteworthy links as well. And similar to how I recommended in the background section with those definitions and descriptions of key terms, for your criteria, I would also recommend, delving into a couple, so maybe 2, 3, or 4, in a bit more depth with a bit more solid evidence than doing surface level for more. So that would be my recommendation for the criteria. So once you have essentially established what factors or what topics are you going to consider when evaluating your research question, then you can do a brief analysis. And again, this is just something that I would personally recommend just based on the fact that there is no proper analysis section. So my recommendation here would be that you relate your criteria back to your central question and use it to evaluate the extent to which your research question is valid or not. So you essentially introduce these concepts and definitions in your theoretical framework, then you present your criteria and solidify these arguments using the literature in the theoretical framework that was established, and you essentially reiterate these findings again in your conclusion. So that's how I would recommend the structure of it, since again, no proper analysis section, so you kind of have to split it up a little bit to actually find a successful answer for your research question. And again, as a reminder, your criteria are sort of those grading rubric categories, so things that you can use to evaluate your research question based on the literature and based on evidence as well. Of course, to find your literature for part 1 and 2, again, I have some recommendations here, but you can just pause the screen and use those if you would like. So in terms of the actual paragraph structure of your theoretical framework, I took this section actually from the analysis part that I covered last year in a knowledge clip, but I think just because of the fact that it needs to be combined in a way, I would recommend this as the paragraph structure for the theoretical framework. And that is primarily to evaluate or order your relevant concepts, to evaluate your chosen factor in order of importance. So what data are the most important in addressing your factors, disadvantages or advantages regarding climate change and policy implementation. So maybe you have 2 factors that you are considering or essentially grading your research question on, which are complexity and measurable impact, and you find that complexity is a more important / evidence-based discussion point, then I would recommend putting that one first in a paragraph and then another paragraph below for measurable impact. That would be my recommendation in terms of like actual paragraph order. But in terms of logical flow within each paragraph, the biggest suggestion I would have is, of course, again, start with part 1. So the background, definitions, key concepts and terms relating to the research question. And then for part 2, which is the relevant criteria and analysis, have those in the follow-up paragraphs, and then within each paragraph, specify which subtopic / criteria you are focusing on to evaluate your research question. Of course, include those required definitions and descriptions of your relevant criteria, and then get into a little bit of an analysis here as well when you are essentially finding evidence validating your research question based on the criteria, then also finding counter literature for the research question, so some caveats maybe for the literature that you have found in support or to basically validate the research question. And of course, after the caveat or the counter literature is introduced, then refute it and state why it's flawed or not developed enough, so on. And then conclude the paragraph by referencing back to your central question and along with basically the statement on the extent to which the central question is valid. So very regularly referencing back to the central question, I would say, is a really key component throughout your entire essay to make sure that the focus is still very strongly maintained and it's not lost in all of the evidence and all the literature that you are going to use for your analysis within your theoretical framework, and also, of course, linking it back in the conclusion section. So this is how I would recommend structuring the paragraphs and also just structuring the theoretical framework in general. Of course, this is my own personal suggestion, but if you do have recommendations from your tutorial teacher to do something else, then please go with that and listen to them first and foremost, as I've stated here. But hopefully, if there hasn't been that much direction, then I really hope that this clip has been useful for you in terms of fixing or identifying how you want to approach the theoretical framework. And yeah, thank you again so much for your time and for watching this video. There will be another video on the conclusion very soon, of course, before your deadline, but a little bit closer. So yeah, expect a video on that to help you wrap up your final section of your writing assignment. But again, thank you so much for joining today and for watching, and I will see you in the next knowledge clip.